On the evening of June 24th, 2026, the ground west of Caracas moved twice in 39 seconds. The first shock measured magnitude 7.2. The second, magnitude 7.5. It was the most powerful earthquake to strike Venezuela since 1900. In the days that followed, the toll climbed into the thousands, with many thousands more injured and vast numbers of people still unaccounted for beneath the concrete. Entire blocks west of the capital had folded into rubble in under a minute. 5 weeks later, on July 28th, the earth moved again, this time under Kumamoto, on Japan's southern island of Kyushu. The shaking registered magnitude 7.1, later revised to 6.8. A shopping mall's second floor pancaked onto the first, trapping shoppers. Bullet trains braked to a halt. An airport runway closed. Nuclear plants ran their automatic checks. And when the counting was done, the dead numbered a tiny fraction of the toll 5 weeks earlier. Hold those two outcomes next to each other. Thousands dead in Venezuela. A small fraction of that in Japan. The Venezuelan quake released more energy, considerably more, but not nearly enough to explain a gap that wide. Something other than geology decided who lived and who did not. And that something was not written on the day the ground shook. That is the subject of this video, because an earthquake is a natural event, but a death toll is a human decision made years earlier in building codes, in enforcement offices, in budget lines, in whether a country chose to spend money and attention on a disaster it knew, with certainty, was coming eventually. The fault only sets the stage. Society writes the ending. To understand why the same violence underground produced two opposite outcomes above it, we have to follow the entire chain. Why the earth shakes at all. Why the exact moment can never be predicted. How modern warning systems buy their handful of precious seconds. What the magnitude numbers actually mean. And finally, what separates a nation that survives its faults from one that is buried by them. The story runs straight through both countries, and it ends with a choice. The first question anyone asks when two large earthquakes hit within weeks is whether they are connected. They are not. The fault under Venezuela and the fault under Kyushu are 10,000 miles apart on entirely different plate boundaries, and no known physical mechanism links a rupture in the Caribbean to a rupture in the Western Pacific. Stress does not travel across the planet like that. What feels like an ominous cluster is mostly arithmetic. According to long-term records kept since about 1900, the planet produces roughly 15 to 18 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater every single year, plus about one of magnitude 8 or larger. That is more than one major earthquake every month on average, somewhere on Earth. 2 in 5 weeks is not a signal. It is a Tuesday. Most of them you never hear about because they strike under the ocean, or beneath empty land, or in countries without cameras pointed at the wreckage. The two that dominated headlines in the summer of 2026 did so not because they were rare in size, but because they struck people. And because one of them struck people who were catastrophically unprepared to be struck. The perception that there are more earthquakes lately is also an illusion of measurement. There are now tens of thousands of seismometers, where a century ago, there were a few hundred. We detect and report far more quakes than we ever could before, which makes the modern record look busier, even though the underlying rate of large events has stayed remarkably steady across decades of observation. So the honest answer to the first question is that two big earthquakes, weeks apart, is not a sign of anything. Not a hidden pattern, not a warning, not the planet somehow waking up. It is what a statistically ordinary year looks like when you happen to notice it. The real story was never that the Earth shook twice in 5 weeks. The real story is what happened next, on the surface, in two profoundly different societies. The outer shell of the planet is not one solid piece. It is broken into about 15 major slabs of rock, called tectonic plates, floating on the hot, slow-flowing mantle beneath them. These plates are always moving, a few centimeters a year, roughly the speed your fingernails grow, driven by heat rising from deep inside the Earth and the slow churn of the mantle. Where plates meet, they do not glide past each other cleanly. Their rough edges lock together, while the enormous forces behind them keep pushing. Stress accumulates in the rock the way it builds in a green stick you are slowly bending toward its snapping point. For years, decades, sometimes centuries, the fault holds firm, silently storing an almost unimaginable amount of energy in the strained rock on either side. Then it fails. In a few seconds, the rock tears past itself along the fault line and springs back toward its unstressed shape. Geologists call this elastic rebound, and it is the heart of nearly every earthquake. The stored energy, released all at once, radiates outward in every direction as seismic waves. And those waves, reaching the surface, are what we feel as the ground shaking beneath our feet. The waves arrive in a specific order, and that order will matter enormously later in this story. First come the P waves, fast-moving pressure waves that hit as a sharp jolt, but generally do little structural damage. Behind them come the slower S waves and the surface waves, which shake the ground violently from side to side and up and down. Those are the destroyers, the waves that crack walls, buckle columns, and bring floors down. This is the engine running underneath both of our stories. Venezuela and Japan sit on different plate boundaries, with different geometries and different personalities, but the underlying physics is identical. Locked rock, accumulating stress, sudden catastrophic release. The difference between the two disasters was never in the engine itself. It was in everything human beings had chosen to build, or not build, on top of it. Most people do not picture Venezuela as earthquake country. They should. Northern Venezuela sits squarely on the boundary where the Caribbean plate grinds eastward past the South American plate at roughly 2 centimeters a year. And that boundary is not a single clean line. It is a wide, fractured zone of faulting that runs directly beneath the country's most heavily populated northern strip, including the corridor around Caracas. The main structure has a name, the Boconó-Morón-El Pilar Fault System, a 1,300-kilometer network of faults stretching from the Venezuelan Andes all the way to the northeastern coast. This is the same family of faults that devastated the city of Cumaná in 1997, and, further back, produced the magnitude 7.7 catastrophe of 1900. The June 2026 rupture west of Caracas was the strongest event the country had seen since that turn-of-the-century disaster. What made 2026 so lethal was partly the mechanics of the rupture. The shocks were relatively shallow, which concentrates their violence at the surface rather than dissipating it through miles of rock. And they came as a doublet, 2 major ruptures 39 seconds apart. So structures cracked and weakened by the first blow were struck again before anyone inside could react, brace, or flee into the open. But shallow doubled ruptures do not, on their own, kill thousands. The fault delivered a magnitude 7.5, an unquestionably severe event. Whether that severity translated into a difficult emergency or a mass casualty catastrophe depended entirely on what stood above the fault. And in the towns and cities west of Caracas, much of what stood above it was a housing stock built decades ago, a great deal of it predating any modern seismic design at all. That is the quiet tragedy folded into the geology. Venezuela's faults were mapped. Their rupture history was documented. The 1900 and 1997 disasters were on the record for anyone to read. The hazard was never a mystery, never a surprise ambush by nature. The country understood precisely where the danger lived and roughly how violent it could become. What follows is the story of a nation on the far side of the world that faced a larger, more relentless version of the very same threat and answered it in almost the opposite way. If Venezuela's seismic danger is chronically underestimated, Japan's is the most respected on Earth, because Japan has never had the luxury of ignoring it. The archipelago sits at the collision point of 4 tectonic plates along the Pacific Ring of Fire, the vast horseshoe of subduction zones and faults responsible for the majority of the world's large earthquakes and active volcanoes. Few inhabited places on the planet shake more. Here, the Pacific and Philippine sea plates dive beneath Japan in a grinding process called subduction, dragging the edge of the country downward until the accumulated strain releases in a sudden lurch. This is the machinery behind the great offshore megaquakes and the tsunamis they unleash, including the magnitude 9.0 Tohoku disaster of March 2011, which killed nearly 20,000 people and permanently reshaped the nation's entire philosophy of risk and preparedness. That memory is not abstract in Japan. In December 2025, a magnitude 7.6 quake off Aomori sent a tsunami warning across the Pacific coast and injured dozens, prompting a rare official advisory that an even stronger shock might follow within a week. The Kumamoto quake of July 28, 2026 was a different, shallower kind of event, a crustal rupture inland on Kyushu rather than an offshore megaquake, but it landed in a country that treats every tremor as a live rehearsal for the next big one. The damage in Kumamoto was real and visible. A shopping mall's floor collapsed. Bullet trains across Kyushu halted for inspection. A tsunami advisory, predicting waves up to a meter went up, was evaluated, and was lifted within 2 hours, when no dangerous wave materialized. Yet the human cost stayed remarkably low. In a nation of 125 million people packed onto a chronically shaking island chain, a magnitude 6.8 struck a populated city, and the death toll never came close to the scale of the catastrophe next door. That outcome is not luck. Japan absorbs a share of the world's seismic energy wildly out of proportion to its size, and by every natural logic, it should be a permanent graveyard. Instead, it became the global benchmark for surviving the unsurvivable, the case study every other earthquake-prone nation studies. To understand how, we first have to be precise about what these numbers, 6.8, 7.5, actually represent, because the scale that produces them quietly fools almost everyone who hears it. When the news reported Venezuela's quake as a 7.5 and Japan's as a 6.8, it sounded like a small difference, less than a single point apart, barely worth mentioning. It was not small. The scale that measures earthquakes is one of the most misunderstood numbers in all of science, because it is not counting what your intuition assumes it is counting. Modern large earthquakes are measured on the moment magnitude scale, which replaced the older Richter scale for significant events. It is calculated directly from the physics of the rupture, how large an area of fault slipped, how far the rock moved, and the rigidity of that rock. In other words, it measures the actual energy released by the earthquake, not merely how big a squiggle it drew on one particular instrument in one particular place. And crucially, it is logarithmic. Each whole number up the scale represents about 10 times greater shaking amplitude and roughly 32 times more energy released. Not 32% more, 32 times more. Climb 2 whole numbers and you multiply the released energy by about 1,000. A magnitude 8 is not slightly worse than a magnitude 6. It is a different universe of violence. Run that math on our 2 quakes. The difference between Japan's 6.8 and Venezuela's 7.5 is about 0.7 of a magnitude unit, which corresponds to somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 times more energy released in Venezuela. The Venezuelan fault did not shake a little harder than the Japanese one. It unleashed close to an order of magnitude more raw power into the ground and the structures standing on it. That difference is real, and it matters. But here is the punchline that should stay with you for the rest of this video. Even accounting for 8 to 10 times more energy, the death tolls differed not by a little, but by orders of magnitude. Energy alone cannot come anywhere near bridging that gap. The magnitude scale explains, cleanly, why Venezuela's quake was far more violent. It explains almost nothing about why it was so much more lethal. For that, we have to leave the geology behind entirely. The most natural question after any disaster is, why didn't anyone see it coming? The uncomfortable answer, stated flatly and repeatedly by the United States Geological Survey, is that no one could. Neither the USGS nor any other scientists have ever predicted a major earthquake, the agency writes. We do not know how, and we do not expect to know how, any time in the foreseeable future. That is not modesty. It is the current limit of the science. A genuine prediction, by the strict definition scientists use, would have to specify 3 things simultaneously: the date and time, the location, and the magnitude. Anyone who claims to have foreseen a quake but cannot pin down all 3 has not actually predicted anything. And the faults themselves offer no reliable countdown. The stress accumulating in rock miles underground gives off no signal we have yet learned to read in advance. People have tried nearly everything over the past century. Radon gas seeping from wells, strange animal behavior before shocks, statistical patterns of small foreshocks, electromagnetic emissions from stressed rock. None has ever produced a repeatable, actionable warning. For every apparent success, there are countless failures and false alarms. And a false alarm that needlessly evacuates a city of millions carries its own severe economic and human costs. This is a genuinely hard thing for the human mind to accept, because we crave the idea that disaster is foreseeable. A foreseeable disaster feels like a controllable one. But the honest science insists that the precise moment a given fault will slip is, for now, truly unknowable. As unknowable as which exact kernel in the pot will be the next to pop, even though you know, with certainty, that popping is coming. And yet, this is the distinction that changes everything. "We cannot predict earthquakes" is not the same sentence as "we are helpless before them." It means we have to defend ourselves along two entirely different lines instead, by forecasting the risk across long stretches of time, and by warning people in the final few seconds once a rupture has already begun. Those two tools, not prediction, are what actually save lives, and they are exactly where our two countries diverged. If prediction tries to pinpoint a single event, forecasting maps the odds, and here, the science is genuinely powerful. Scientists cannot tell you that a fault will rupture next Tuesday, but they can tell you with real rigor that a given fault has, for example, a 30% chance of producing a major earthquake within the next 30 years. That is not a shrug or a guess. It is built painstakingly from the geologic record. The method is patient detective work spread across years. Researchers dig trenches across faults to read the fingerprints of past ruptures in the layered soil, measure how fast plates are creeping with satellite GPS, and calculate how much stress has quietly accumulated since the last major release. From all of that, they produce seismic hazard maps, the color-coded charts that tell engineers how hard the ground is likely to shake at any given location over a given span of decades. These maps are the foundation of everything that follows, because they convert an unpredictable threat into a solvable design problem. If you know a region can expect violent shaking sometime in the next 50 years, you cannot know the calendar date, but you can absolutely build for the shaking. The hazard stops being a random ambush and becomes an engineering specification, printed and available years before the fault ever moves. Both Venezuela and Japan possessed this knowledge. Venezuela's faults were mapped, and its history of destructive quakes well documented in the scientific literature. Japan's hazard maps are among the most detailed and continuously updated on the planet. Neither country was blindsided in any scientific sense. The forecast existed, on paper, in both capitals. What differed, profoundly, was what each society chose to do with the forecast once it held it in its hands. This is the true hinge of the entire story, so it is worth stating plainly. Forecasting hands every earthquake-prone nation the identical gift. Decades of advance warning expresses probability about a danger that is certain to arrive, but never on a schedule anyone can name. What separates the survivors from the buried is never who received the forecast, it is who acted on it. And the action begins in the final seconds before the shaking, with a technology that literally races the seismic waves themselves. Remember the two kinds of seismic waves: the fast, relatively harmless P wave, and the slower, destructive S wave that follows close behind it. That gap between them, often just a handful of seconds, is the entire foundation of earthquake early warning. This is not prediction, and it is important to be clear about that. The quake has already begun. The system is simply faster than the damage itself. Japan operates the most advanced version on Earth. Its network of more than 4,000 seismometers detects the P wave the instant a rupture starts, and computers estimate the earthquake's location and size within 3 to 5 seconds, before the slower, more destructive S wave has traveled far from the epicenter. If the system forecasts strong shaking, it fires an alert to virtually every phone, television, and public loudspeaker in the danger zone at once. The warning time is brutally short and depends entirely on distance from the epicenter. Directly above it, you may get 1 second, or nothing at all. 100 kilometers away, you might get 20 or 30 seconds of grace. It sounds almost trivial. It is not. A few seconds turns out to be exactly enough time to stop the things that most need stopping before the violent waves arrive. And Japan stops a remarkable amount automatically, without waiting for any human to react. On warning, bullet trains slam on their brakes to prevent derailment at 300 kilometers an hour. Factory lines halt. Elevators open their doors at the nearest floor so no one is sealed inside a shaking shaft. Gas valves close to prevent the fires that so often follow quakes. Surgeons pause mid-operation. Millions of people receive the same blunt instruction simultaneously. Strong shaking is coming. Protect yourself now. None of this requires having known the earthquake was coming yesterday or last year. It requires only detecting the rupture in its first heartbeat and acting before the second one. This is the technological answer to an unpredictable planet, not foresight, but reflex, engineered into the infrastructure itself. And it is precisely the kind of system that existed, richly, in one of our two countries, and, effectively, did not exist at all in the other. When Kumamoto ruptured on July 28th, Japan's warning machinery did exactly what it was built to do. Bullet trains across Kyushu stopped for automatic safety checks. The nuclear regulator confirmed within hours that 3 nearby power plants showed no abnormalities. A tsunami advisory was issued, evaluated against real ocean readings, and withdrawn within 2 hours. The country's reflexes fired in sequence, as designed, before most people had finished registering what was happening. That technological reflex is layered on top of something even more important and much harder to buy: a population that already knows exactly what to do the instant an alert sounds. Japanese school children drill for earthquakes the way children elsewhere drill for fire, repeatedly from a young age. The instinct to drop and take cover is trained deep, so the precious warning seconds are not squandered in confusion or panic. They are spent taking concrete protective action. Venezuela had effectively none of this. There is no comparable nationwide early warning network wired into people's phones, no reflexive automatic braking of trains and machinery, no ingrained national culture of routine drills reaching every citizen from childhood. When the ground moved west of Caracas, the first sign for most people was the shaking itself, the destructive S-wave arriving with no herald, no countdown, and no chance to brace. The contrast is stark, but it should not be read as a simple morality tale of one clever nation and one careless one. Early warning systems are genuinely expensive and demanding. They require dense sensor networks, robust and redundant telecommunications, constant maintenance, and sustained public investment across decades. They are, in the end, the product of a functioning, stable state with money to spend, and the institutional continuity to keep spending it long after the last disaster has faded from memory. Which points directly at the deeper divide beneath everything. An alert that gives you 10 seconds is a genuine marvel of engineering. But 10 seconds only saves your life if the building you are standing in does not come down on top of you. The warning buys time. The structure decides your fate. And it is in the structures, in the concrete, the steel, and the rules that govern how they are assembled that the true, decisive gulf between Venezuela and Japan finally opens wide. The single most powerful earthquake safety technology in existence is not a sensor, an app, or a satellite. It is the building code. The boring, unglamorous, invisible set of rules dictating how a structure must be built to remain standing when the ground moves. More than the warning systems, more than the drills, more than anything else, the code is what separated 2 lost lives from thousands. Japan rewrote its rules in blood, again and again. After a destructive 1978 quake struck Miyagi, the building standards law was overhauled in 1981 to require that new structures survive strong shaking without collapse. After the 1995 Kobe earthquake killed more than 6,000 people, the standards were tightened yet again, and older, vulnerable buildings were pushed toward retrofit. Today, high-rises in Tokyo ride on base isolators and giant shock absorbers, engineered to sway and flex rather than shatter. The result is a national building stock designed, floor by floor and joint by joint, to fail gently, or not at all. For wooden houses, retrofits focus on the joints and foundations, metal connectors at the corners, continuous concrete footings, plywood-reinforced walls. When Kumamoto shook, a mall's second floor did collapse, a serious and frightening failure. But the overwhelming majority of structures around it held firm, and the people inside them walked out alive. That is what a well-enforced code looks like on the single day it is finally tested. Venezuela's problem was never the simple absence of a code. On paper, the country adopted a modern seismic standard, Covenant 1756, updated in 2019, and regarded by engineers as a high-quality, internationally aligned framework. The problem was everything surrounding the code. Enforcement, hollowed out by years of deep economic collapse, and a large share of the housing stock in cities like Caracas built before the 1970s, under rules that predate modern seismic design entirely. A code that is not enforced is just a document in a drawer. Buildings raised without meaningful inspection, with substandard concrete and inadequate reinforcing steel, sitting on a mapped and demonstrably active fault, will do exactly what physics demands the moment that fault slips. The engineers who surveyed the ruins were blunt about it. This was less a purely natural disaster than a structural one, a long-known hazard finally colliding with decades of deferred, unfunded protection. And deferred protection is, at its root, always a question of money. Every earthquake death toll has a budget sitting behind it. Preparedness is never free. It is a continuous stream of spending, sustained across decades, on things that produce no visible benefit whatsoever until the single day the ground finally moves. Dense sensor networks, enforced building inspections, retrofit subsidies, nationwide public drills. Each is a real cost, paid now, against a catastrophe that may not arrive for another generation, if it arrives on your watch at all. This is the hardest category of investment any society can make, precisely because its payoff is invisible and its timing unknowable. A retrofitted building that quietly survives a quake looks identical to one that was never at risk in the first place. The disaster that does not happen generates no headlines, no gratitude, and no monument. Politicians almost never win elections campaigning on the earthquakes they quietly prevented, because a prevented earthquake leaves no trace anyone can photograph. Japan made the investment anyway, relentlessly and permanently, for two reasons. Its geology left it no alternative, and its economy could bear the enormous cost. Tokyo wards subsidize seismic diagnosis and retrofit construction. Tax deductions reward compliance. The world's densest seismic sensor network runs continuously, day and night. It is a vast, standing expenditure that the country treats as non-negotiable core infrastructure, in the same category as water, roads, and electricity, not as an optional line item to trim in lean years. Venezuela's deeper tragedy is that it once had the right ingredients, real codes, real disaster plans, and then watched them erode as the economy contracted and the state came under strain. When a government is fighting simply to keep basic services running, the money for enforcement, retrofits, and warning systems is almost always the first to vanish, precisely because its benefit is deferred and invisible. The forecast clearly said the quake was coming someday. The budget that might have prepared for it had already been spent elsewhere, or never existed to begin with. So the brutal equation beneath our two numbers finally comes into sharp focus. Thousands of deaths in one country, and a small fraction of that in the other, is not, at bottom, a story about tectonic plates or wave physics. It is a story about which society could afford, financially, politically, and institutionally, to convert decades of clear scientific warning into concrete, steel, sensors, and trained reflexes. The fault delivered fundamentally the same kind of blow to both countries. Only one of them had spent the years and the fortunes required to build the shield. All of this, the codes, the budgets, the warning systems, operates far above the level of any single person. But when the shaking actually starts around you, everything narrows to a handful of seconds, and what you personally do with them. Here, the science is settled and unambiguous, and it flatly contradicts some of the most popular earthquake advice you have almost certainly heard repeated over the years. The correct action, endorsed by professional rescue teams and emergency agencies worldwide, is deliberately simple. Drop, cover, and hold on. Drop down to your hands and knees before the shaking can knock you off your feet. Take cover under a sturdy table or desk to shield your head and torso from falling objects. And hold on to that shelter, moving with it if it slides, until the shaking finally stops. 3 steps, memorized, that work in the chaos. The reasoning rests on hard data. In modern earthquakes, the majority of injuries come not from entire buildings pancaking, but from flying and falling objects, toppling bookshelves, dropping light fixtures, shattering glass, unsecured furniture launched across a room. Getting low and covered protects you from the threat that is statistically most likely to injure you, in exactly those first violent seconds when you cannot safely move anywhere else at all. 2 persistent myths do genuine, measurable harm here. The first is the doorway, a reasonable idea in a 19th century adobe house, but useless in a modern one, where the frame is no stronger than the surrounding wall and offers zero protection from projectiles. The second is the so-called triangle of life, a viral internet theory urging people to lie down beside heavy furniture rather than crawl under it. Emergency experts have flatly and repeatedly discredited it. following its advice can get you killed rather than save you. If you happen to live somewhere an early warning system exists, those alert seconds are for one thing and one thing only. Get into the drop, cover, and hold on position immediately, and do not run outside, where falling facades, glass, and debris are historically the deadliest place to be. The individual's job in an earthquake is small, specific, and learnable in a minute. But it only works if the structure around that person was built well enough to give them a floor left to survive on. Which carries us one last time back to the difference between our two countries. Let us return to the raw ledger, now that we understand exactly what stands behind it. Venezuela, a magnitude 7.5 doublet that killed thousands, injured many thousands more, left vast numbers unaccounted for, and destroyed hundreds of structures across the region. Japan, a magnitude 6.8 in a populated city, a collapsed mall floor, suspended bullet trains, functioning nuclear plants, and a death toll smaller by orders of magnitude. Adjust for energy, and Venezuela's quake was perhaps 8 to 10 times more powerful than Japan's. Adjust for everything else that matters, and that factor all but disappears beside a death toll gap of orders of magnitude. The geology accounts for a thin sliver of the gap between those outcomes. The preparation, the codes, the enforcement, the warning, the drills, the money accounts for very nearly all of it. Sit for a moment with the vast number of people left unaccounted for. Behind those missing are buildings that came down when they did not have to come down, structures standing on a mapped, active, thoroughly documented fault, raised or left in place without the seismic protection that structural engineering has understood well for more than half a century. These were, in large measure, not deaths that geology made inevitable. They were, in the careful language of the specialists who surveyed the wreckage, a man-made dimension layered directly on top of a natural event. And sit too with Japan's toll. Not zero. The Earth extracts a price even from the very best prepared societies, and Japan grieves every life lost as real and irreplaceable. But a toll that small, in a dense city struck squarely by a major earthquake, is what it looks like when a nation spends decades and vast fortunes methodically converting a known, unavoidable threat into codes, sensors, drills, and enforced concrete. That restraint is the measure of a shield that, on the day of the test, mostly held. This is the ledger this video set out to explain from its first sentence. Two nations, one shared planet, the same underlying physics, the same unpredictable faults grinding beneath their feet. One toll in the thousands, the other a small fraction of it. And the difference between them was written not on June 24th or July 28th in the violence of the rupture, but in every quiet, unremarkable year before, in the accumulated choices each society made about a disaster it always knew, with certainty, would eventually come. So, is it normal for two large earthquakes to strike weeks apart? Yes, statistically ordinary, in a world that reliably produces more than a dozen major quakes every year. Can they be predicted? No, not the date, the place, and the magnitude together, and almost certainly not for a very long time to come. Can we defend ourselves against them anyway? Absolutely. And that, in the end, is the entire point of everything we have covered. The defense does not come from foreseeing the future, because the future of a fault genuinely cannot be foreseen. It comes instead from accepting one permanent, uncomfortable truth, that the ground will move, on a schedule no one can ever read, and then building for it regardless. Forecasting turns the unknowable into a design problem with decades of lead time. Early warning turns the first faint tremor into a handful of precious seconds. Codes, enforcement, and retrofits turn those seconds into survival. Venezuela and Japan received precisely the same scientific gift: decades of clear warning, expressed as probability, about faults that would certainly rupture eventually. What separated them was never the knowledge itself. It was whether the state had the money, the stability, and the sustained institutional will to convert that knowledge into steel, sensors, and enforced rules. The quiet, invisible investments that only ever reveal their true worth on the single worst day. That is precisely why an earthquake is a natural event, but a death toll is a human one. The planet writes the hazard, indifferent and unstoppable. Societies write the outcome, in the years no one is paying attention, in budget lines and inspection offices, and the unglamorous discipline of a code that is actually enforced rather than merely printed. The fault does not care who lives. The preparation is, from beginning to end, a choice. If this way of seeing the world, following the money, the mechanism, and the consequence beneath the headlines, is why you came here, consider subscribing, and share this with someone who still assumes an earthquake is simply a matter of bad luck. Tell us in the comments which hidden system you want us to take apart next. The ground will move again somewhere on this planet, sooner than we think. The only question that has ever truly mattered is what we chose to build before it did.